much, Madam Chair. And the Minister has rightly said he's been landed in it by his colleagues, because let's be in no doubt that if approved, these regulations would cause serious damage to our manufacturing sector and likely result in a loss of thousands of skilled jobs. They replace the expiring UK steel safeguard, and in 2 weeks today, manufacturing and engineering businesses will be hit with a 50% tariff on steel imports across 20 product categories. Bright bar, wire and stainless steel are captured for the first time. As the Minister said, the preferential rates, aside from those for Ukraine, are also taken away. And the Government has said, in justifying this policy, that higher tariffs will only apply to steel that is or could be made in the UK. But the industry has repeatedly said to ministers, to opposition members, that that is not the case. Those firms are clear that UK mills cannot produce the grades and type of steel that their businesses require. When I raised this question with another one of the Minister's colleagues, the Industry Minister, in the urgent question, where a number of Labour members spoke against these regulations, I look forward to the contributions of committee members on those lines as well. When I raised that, the Minister said, oh, well, there's three mills in the country which could, with investment and additional capacity, provide that. But let's get real, these regulations come into effect, if approved, in just 2 weeks. That is not enough time to stand up the investment and the production for the grades of steel, the specification and the volume that so many manufacturing businesses need. And I've met companies in my constituency and beyond, and their message is stark, that the government is jeopardising jobs in crucial sectors in a flawed attempt to protect UK steelmaking. And this approach fails to understand how supply chains in defence, aerospace and other sectors work, and why these sectors will these regulations will actually undermine our national security. The newly broadened commodity codes are set out, as the Minister said, in the tariff of the UK, the 18,053 pages of it, and the quotas which will accompany this rate will be in separate regulations, as the Minister referred, which means that industry currently has no certainty. And these regulations are a risk to manufacturing jobs. They've been rushed without an adequate evidence base, and the codes are drawn so broadly that they catch manufacturers for whom no domestic alternative exists. And the instrument will simply not achieve the government's aims, so we won't be supporting it today. And it is important, and I acknowledge the point the Minister made about the global overcapacity of steel. And the US, Canada and the EU have introduced similar tariffs. And of course, domestic production is important to our national security. But agreeing with the importance of the production of steel capacity in the UK is not the same as agreeing with the approach that the government's taking through these regulations. The downstream steel using sector employs 300,000 workers. Primary steel making employs 30,000. Any credible strategy must account for both sides of that equation. But let's be clear on what these regulations are. There are a 50% tax on steel that British manufacturers cannot always source domestically because it simply is not made here or is not produced in the necessary volumes. And that's why industry is sounding the alarm at the scope. The stated policy is to protect all steel products which could be made in the UK, covering 100% of domestic production. But the commodity codes are drawn so broadly, they are catching manufacturers for whom there is no viable domestic alternative. It will be felt by British manufacturers that rely on specialist steel to produce high-value components for aerospace, for defence, for Formula One motorsport, for energy and precision engineering. Those impacted are the manufacturers, the fabricators, the engineers, the specialist processors who depend on steel import support inputs that are simply not available in the UK. Materials used in house building, rail, logistics centres, food warehouses, pharmaceutical facilities, roofing, cladding and other specialist building capability will be hit. The fabrication sector, this was another point raised by colleagues from across the House in the urgent question earlier, have warned that 30,000 jobs could be at risk from these regulations and the tariff that they introduce as overseas competitors simply ship in fabricated products tariff-free. Canada amended its tariffs to include fabricated steelworks. I look forward to the Minister explaining why the government has chosen not to do the same. Our defence sector was represented at a round table I was at earlier this week with colleagues from the Liberal Democrats and other parties, and many of the specialist steels used by UK manufacturers are currently not produced, approved or supplied at scale in the UK in the required grades. This is particularly acute in categories 14 and 27, which are currently due to face those 50% tariffs once significantly reduced quotas are exhausted. This is not simply a matter of flicking a switch and changing supplier. In many cases, the steels that are required, for example in aerospace, are subject to very strict technical approvals, very lengthy certification requirements and customer specifications, with supplier approval often taking years. The supply chain, these partnerships, are decades in the making. And UK producers are unable to say if they'll be able to produce what is needed. Companies can't work on a could be produced in the UK. They need the product now. These regulations come into effect, if approved by government members, in 2 weeks. So there's a clear ask which I put to the Minister. Will he at least remove categories 14 and 27 from the incoming tariff regime where there is insufficient domestic production capability, ensuring tariffs are not applied to specialist steels that the UK does not currently produce? And if UK firms cannot access the material they need at competitive prices because of the tariffs that these regulations introduce, then customers may cut the UK production. They may well move sourcing overseas or relocate parts of the supply chain to avoid avoidable cost increases. That's certainly something that Airbus were talking about in terms of the next generation of civil aerospace. It's unlikely to come to the UK if the tariffs make us far less competitive than the other 3 European EU partners of Airbus. And the Confederation of British Metal Forming reports manufacturers are already reviewing offshoring options and indeed moving abroad. And the British Chambers of Commerce has warned that firms may need to halt production altogether or are considering relocating. And once manufacturing capability leaves the UK, it is very difficult to draw it back, particularly with the energy policy that this government is following and the prices that flow as a result. And as the CBM's president has put it, you cannot protect upstream production at the expense of downstream survival. The Minister will doubtless be aware that Canada offers steel tariff relief through a remission framework, allowing Canadian businesses to request relief if they are unable to source specific steel imports domestically. What assessment has the government made of such an approach? Because if companies can demonstrate they cannot source the steel in the UK, then the government's policy intent is that they should not be penalised. Such a relief scheme would achieve that aim. And of course, if companies are effectively required to buy from UK producers, then pricing will reflect the tariffs. Industry are already reporting that quotes they are getting for product are priced just below where the 50% tariff would fall. Who'd have thunk it? Vital inputs are also only made by UK Steel, which is behind its planned levels of production and would of course then be a monopoly supplier. Firms either have to risk unpredictable supply or expensive imports. And given the long-term fixed-price contracts that are common across the defence supply chain with tens of thousands of SMEs, a 50% tariff cost through these regulations cannot easily be passed on, to say it lightly. One SME at the round table told me that it would mean an extra £1.2 million on their turnover, around £30 million, which they simply would be unable to fund. So companies will be incentivised to move production overseas, and ministers should be listening to these siren calls and acting before it is too late and jobs are offshored. Even at this late stage, what engagement is the minister having, perhaps with his ministerial colleagues who are leading on much of the policy here, and with industry, to ensure that costs are contained and downstream manufacturing is protected? Of course, the tariffs will, if they are approved, come into force, and then there will be quota rates, but the government has already said that they will be substantially lower than under the steel safeguard, cutting quota volumes by an estimated 60% overall and up to 97% in some categories will be achieved through the negative resolutions. And in discussions with honourable members, including members of the Labour Party that I was at The business minister said the government was still negotiating those changes and where the tariffs would sit, and I understand that and the discussions that are going on with the EU, but that means companies still lack the certainty before these come into force in 2 weeks. And I implore the Minister to ensure that the tariff quota levels are set at a sufficient volume to avoid the huge damage to our industrial base, which companies have been very clear is likely to happen if they proceed on this basis. And will the Minister commit to keep these regulations under review? At the moment it's proposed they'll be reviewed only every 12 months. That is utterly inadequate given the risk that we are all being told about by companies in our constituency. So I hope he'll commit to reviewing them more regularly. Lastly, I turn to a topic that I regularly raise when the Treasury brings forward measures, and that is the absence of a substantive and costed impact assessment. It's frankly astonishing for a change of this magnitude that the downstream effects have not been properly looked at by the Treasury or the Business Department. The explanatory memorandum, such as it is, admits these measures will raise steel prices, increase costs for user industries, harm downstream businesses, and impact small and micro businesses. I wonder why they haven't done a fully costed impact of what that will mean for our aerospace, for our defence, for our construction and other sectors that rely on steel. Perhaps the Minister can explain why it doesn't. National steel capacity matters for defence, for national security and for supply chain resilience. But these regulations simply fail to achieve the government's objective and instead pose a threat to 300,000 jobs in downstream manufacturing. Ministers say they are listening, but they haven't put forward any changes or solutions to the problems that have been raised by companies. There is still just time for them to do that and avoid the enormous damage that is being warned about. If ministers are determined to press ahead, then we have two further requests. First, that they delay the implementation of these tariffs for at least 6 months to give manufacturers as much possible time to adjust. And secondly, that they develop more forensic definitions and exclude grades, sizes and specifications of specialist steel that is not produced in the UK. We will be voting against this measure and asking the government urgently to reconsider their plans and instead to project jobs and to promote economic growth.
Joshua Reynolds.